The light that was then moved through the outer corridors of the conclave chamber the way old light moves, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with a deep, unhurried certainty of a thing that has existed long enough to understand that stillness and motion are merely different expressions of the same patience. His luminescence had shifted over the centuries from the bright, white gold of early life to something richer, something amber-threaded and deep, a color the younger Sorvath called resonance hue, the particular shade that 400 years of accumulated experience pressed into a being of pure, concentrated light. He was old. By the standards of the Sorvath collective, he was ancient, and he had never, in 400 years, brought news of the five voices that made his own light tremble. It trembled now. The conclave chamber was a structure the Sorvath had grown from crystallized starlight over 3,000 years, a vast enclosed space where light could speak to light without the interference of lesser physics, where the frequencies of thought could resonate cleanly between beings who communicated not in sound but in the modulated pulse and flicker of their own luminescence. The chamber's walls were not walls in any conventional sense, but rather boundary states, regions where the Sorvath had persuaded the fabric of space itself to hold a shape, to maintain a curvature that kept their conversations intimate and their deliberations private. Within those boundary states, the light of hundreds of Sorvath voices could gather and intermingle, each being's frequency distinct and recognizable the way a particular star's spectrum is distinct from all other stars, and yet harmonizing, resonating, building into something greater than any individual illumination. Today the chamber held only 6 presences. Vehn, and the 5 voices. He had requested a closed session, which was itself unusual enough to have set the outer corridors of the collective's administrative structures humming with quiet speculation. Arch-Navigator Vehn, who had mapped 11,000 star systems across 4 centuries, who had charted the magnetic current paths between star clusters that allowed the Sorvath to travel vast distances as easily as water finds its downward route, who had discovered and catalogued 47 distinct species of non-Sorvath intelligence across the known galaxy, Arch-Navigator Vehn did not request closed sessions. He submitted his charts. He filed his observational records. He occasionally lectured, in the particular way of beings who have seen much and find the accumulated weight of unsaid things eventually intolerable, to the younger navigators who came to him with their questions and their bright, eager light. He did not request closed sessions with the 5 voices. The 5 voices were themselves remarkable presences. Each had held their governing position for no fewer than 200 years, selected through a process so complex and so intertwined with the Sorvath's deepest cultural traditions that the selection itself took a generation to complete. First voice Ethan was the oldest of them, nearly 600 years of accumulated light, her frequency so deep and resonant that younger Sorvath sometimes felt her presence before they saw her, a low harmonic in the space that announced itself before she fully materialized. Second voice Aura specialized in the theoretical physics of stellar formation, and had spent 2 centuries developing the mathematical models that describe how the Sorvath's magnetic current paths related to the gravitational structures of the larger galactic web. Third voice SYL was a historian, keeper of the collective's living records, her memory so vast and so precisely organized that she served as a library as much as a governing voice, capable of retrieving specific observation from 3,000 years of Sorvath history with a precision that no external archive could match. Fourth voice Tan was the youngest of the 5, barely 200 years of experience, but his particular genius lay in pattern recognition, in seeing the structural relationships between apparently unrelated phenomena with clarity that had earned him his position despite his relative youth. And fifth voice Merith was the collective's primary diplomat, the being responsible for managing the Sorvath's relationships with the 31 other sapient species the collective had encountered and entered into formal relations with, a diplomat so subtle in his negotiations that other species often left conversations with him feeling they had achieved exactly what they wanted while only gradually realizing, much later, that what they had wanted had been gently and expertly shaped by his guidance. These 5 presences arranged themselves around Vehn in a loose configuration of the chamber's geometry encouraged, each at a slightly different elevation, that combined light filling the space with a rich, complex illumination that was itself a kind of conversation, each of the 5 broadcasting a frequency of calm attention, of receptive waiting, that was the Sorvath equivalent of a formal audience. Vehn collected himself. He had been a navigator for so long that the motion of bringing his thoughts into order felt like the motion of plotting a course. Identify the starting point, identify the destination, find the most honest path between them. He began with the data. For 3 months, he had been organizing what he had found at the absolute edge of the mapped universe, compiling his observations into the precise, layered format the Sorvath used for formal records, cross-referencing them against 400 years of his own personal catalogs and against the broader archives of Collective's 3,000-year history. He broadcast these records now into the shared space of the chamber, modulating his light to carry not just the raw information, but the specific frequencies that indicated source, method of observation, degree of confidence in each measurement. The Sorvath did not lie to each other in the way that some species constructed fossils from manipulated language. They could modulate their frequencies deceptively if they chose, but such deception was detectable by any sufficiently experienced observer, and 500 years of social evolution had made such deception essentially socially extinct. What Vehn broadcast now was clean, precise, and unambiguous. This is what I observed. This is how I observed it. This is my confidence level in each observation. The 5 voices received as data in silence that was not truly silence, their frequencies processing and cross-referencing and querying at a speed that Vehn watched with a distant appreciation for the quality of their minds. Then, one by one, their processing frequencies quieted, and the chamber held a different kind of stillness, the stillness of beings who have received information that does not immediately resolve into familiar categories. It was First Voice Ethan who spoke first. "Walk us through the sequence," she said. Her frequency was even, controlled, but Vehn had known her long enough to detect a particular resonance at its edges that indicated she was managing something. "Not the data. Walk us through what you saw." Vehn had known she would ask this. First Voice Ethan was old enough to understand that data and experience were not the same thing, that the raw records he had broadcast told the 5 voices what he had measured but not what it had been like to be present at the edge of everything, watching the universe's outermost lights go dark in a pattern that should not have been possible, in a pattern that had no business existing this far from anything Collective had ever touched. He began to speak. He had been at the outer survey for 60 years before he found it. 60 years of methodical cartographic work in the regions beyond the Threnny Veil, a vast zone of dense interstellar medium that had historically made observation of the truly outer galaxy extremely difficult. The Sorvath Collective had known for centuries that there were stars beyond the Threnny Veil. Their existence was inferable from gravitational effects, from subtle perturbations in the magnetic current paths that the Sorvath used for travel, from the indirect evidence of ancient light that had been traveling inward for so long it carried information about stellar objects that might no longer exist. But direct observation beyond the veil had been impossible until Vehn had, over the course of 2 decades, identified a series of natural gaps in the veil structure, thin regions where the interstellar medium was sparse enough to allow high-frequency observation to pass through. He had spent another 20 years surveying what lay beyond those gaps. Star systems of various ages, some ancient beyond calculation, their stars red and cooling, others younger, burning hot and blue-white in the outer dark. He had catalogued magnetic current path structures in those outer regions, noting with professional satisfaction that the patterns were consistent with his existing models, that the universe at its edges behaved according to the same physics that governed its center. He had found 3 star systems with planetary configurations that suggested the conditions for biological chemistry, though at such distances and at such a remove from any established contact pathways. These were observations for future generations to investigate rather than immediate discoveries of interest to Collective's diplomatic apparatus. He had been methodical and thorough and, in the way of experienced navigators who have learned not to expect surprise, almost entirely unsurprised by anything he found. Until the night. The Sorvath did not have nights in any conventional sense, but Vehn used the word in his personal logs to mark the long periods of low-activity processing he allowed himself between intensive observation sessions, until the period of rest in which his passive monitoring systems, left running while the majority of his active consciousness was quiet, recorded something anomalous in a star cluster he had designated Survey Cluster Outer 7. He had reviewed the passive records when he became fully active again, and he had spent 6 hours, subjective Sorvath time, the precise duration of experience, not the external measurement of stellar cycles, reviewing them before he accepted that the records were accurate. A star in Survey Cluster Outer 7 had gone out, not faded, not collapsed, not undergone any of the stellar evolutionary processes that Vehn, in 400 years of stellar observation, had catalogued in exhaustive detail. It had simply gone out, the way the Sorvath extinguished their ceremonial signal fires at the end of a ceremony, quickly, completely, leaving behind a region of space that was not a remnant nebula or a black hole or neutron star, but simply a place where a star had been and was no longer. He had checked his instruments. He had cross-referenced the observation against the passive monitoring system's independent records. He had reviewed the region's history in his own survey notes, confirming that the star had been burning normally, a mid-sequence yellow star unremarkable in every measurable way, as recently as his last observational pass 43 days before. He had then done what any rigorous navigator does when confronted with an observation that does not fit existing frameworks. He had set up more comprehensive monitoring of Survey Cluster Outer 7 and waited. He waited 14 days. A second star went out. Same manner of extinction. Same completeness. No remnant. No shockwave. No measurable energy release consistent with any known stellar death mechanism. The star was there, and then it was not there. Vehn had stayed at his survey position for another 3 months, monitoring not just Outer 7 but every survey cluster in the outer regions he had charted, extending his observation networks to the limits of his instrument's range. He had watched 6 more stars go dark in Survey Cluster Outer 7 over those 3 months. And as the 8th star was extinguished, he had understood, with a cold clarity that he felt as a dimming of his own light, what the pattern was. The sequence of extinctions was not random. It was not the random statistical scatter of coincidental phenomena, not the kind of cluster that an observer might briefly mistake for pattern before further data revealed its randomness. It was a precise, unambiguous sequence that Vehn recognized because he had grown up with it, because it had been the first sequence he had ever learned as a young and newly coherent Sorvath, because it was a sequence used in the lighting and extinguishing of the great ceremonial signal fires that the Sorvath performed at the marking of every significant cycle in their cultural calendar. The 8-beat of sorrow and return, the most ancient of the Sorvath's ceremonial sequences, dating back to a period before their recorded history, before they had developed the sophisticated frequency language in which they now communicated, from a time when there had been something simpler and had expressed the great emotional truths of their existence in light and darkness rather than in modulated resonance. The 8-beat was first and last the act of loss followed by the possibility of new light. Stars extinguish in a specific pattern, too quick, a pause, 1, a longer pause, too quick, a pause, 3 in slow succession. The 8 beats of the ceremonial sequence. 8 stars, in exactly that order, at intervals that precisely replicated the temporal spacing of the traditional ceremony. Vehn had then done something he had never done in 400 years of navigation. He had abandoned his survey and turned his full attention backward, toward the center of the galaxy, and he had begun to calculate. The pattern of extinction was not stationary. It was moving, not the stars themselves. Stars do not move significantly relative to each other across the timescales Vehn was measuring, but the phenomenon that was extinguishing them. Whatever was doing this was moving through space, proceeding through Survey Cluster Outer 7 on a trajectory that Vehn could calculate from positions and timing of the extinctions. A trajectory that, when extended inward, pointed with mathematical precision at the center of the known galaxy. At the Sorvath home system, he had checked the calculations 17 times. He had found no error. At the rate the phenomenon was moving, it would reach the outer boundary of the Sorvath collective's home region in exactly 100 years. He had returned from the outer survey in 30 days, traveling the magnetic current paths faster than he had ever traveled them in 400 years, his light leaving a trace in the currents that other navigators would find baffling in its urgency, and he had requested a closed session with the 5 voices. The chamber was very still when Vehn finished. 4th voice Tan was the first to respond, and his response was not a word but complex frequency bursts that conveyed, in the Sorvath manner, the simultaneous experience of recognizing a pattern and being profoundly disturbed by the recognition. "The 8-beat," he said. "You are certain?" "I am certain," Vehn said. "My confidence level in the observation is embedded in the records I have shared with you. The probability that this represents a random clustering of stellar extinction events that happens to reproduce the 8-beat sequence, given the precise temporal spacing and the spatial positioning, is. I have seen the probability," 3rd voice SYL said, and her frequency carried something Vehn had never heard in it before, a tremor. SYL, who had organized the entirety of Sorvath history into perfect, accessible order within her vast memory, who had processed and categorized events of such magnitude that the collective's very existence had sometimes hung in the balance of a recall, SYL had a tremor in her voice. "I have also searched my records. There is no external account of the 8-beat sequence. There is no record of the Sorvath having transmitted that sequence in any medium detectable by an external observer. It is not encoded in our navigational broadcasts. It is not present in any of our formal communications with the 31 other species. The 8-beat exists only in our internal records and in our direct ceremonial practice. The implications settled over the chamber like the slow descent of interstellar dust. Second voice Sorvath, the theoretical physicist, spoke with deliberate care. I want to examine the assumption that the phenomenon is moving at a constant rate. You calculated the trajectory and the timing based on a consistent velocity. But we have only 8 data points from a single cluster. The interval between the first and second extinction and the interval between the 7th and 8th, are they consistent with a uniform velocity, or could the phenomenon be accelerating? Consistent with uniform velocity, Vehn said, but I acknowledge the limitation you are identifying. 8 data points from a single cluster are not sufficient to rule out acceleration or deceleration. The 100-year estimate assumes constant rate. If the phenomenon is accelerating, the time to arrival could be significantly less. This observation did not improve the mood of the chamber. Fifth voice Sorvath, who had spent 2 centuries navigating the communication landscapes of 31 other species, spoke with a diplomat precision. There is a fundamental question we must address before any other discussion. Is this contact or coincidence? Is the pattern a signal, or is the 8-beat merely a pattern that we are imposing on data that happens to fit it? Sorvath. First voice Ethan's tone was gentle but firm. The probability of coincidental fit was in the records Vehn shared. Have you reviewed it? I have reviewed it. Then you know that the word coincidence requires qualification. Fifth voice Sorvath's light shifted, acknowledging the point. The probability was not 0, but it was not meaningfully distinguishable from 0 in any practical sense. Very well. Then I reframe. Is this communication, or is it a phenomenon that has nothing to do with us, that independently reproduces a pattern which we recognize only because we are the kind of beings who seek pattern in everything we observe? That is a more intellectually honest framing, second voice Sorvath said, and it is not answerable from the data we currently have. Which suggests, fourth voice Tan said slowly, his pattern recognition mind clearly working through problem as he spoke, that we need more data. We need to observe the phenomenon across more star systems. If it moves from Alpha 7 to the next cluster along its projected trajectory, and if it reproduces the 8-beat there as well, the coincidence hypothesis becomes untenable. And if it uses the 8-beat in each cluster it passes through, then we have not only contact but a phenomenon that is performing the same ceremony repeatedly, which implies. He stopped. The implications of what he was about to say appeared to give even his pattern-seeking mind a moment to pause. Which implies, he continued carefully, that it is not merely reproducing the sequence it observed from us. It is performing the ceremony. It understands what the sequence means. The chamber held that thought in silence for a long time. There is another possibility, third voice SYL said. The 8-beat is, as I said, present only in our internal records and ceremonial practice. Which means that for anything external to know this sequence, it must have been observing us for a very long time. Not just observing our navigational broadcasts or our diplomatic transmissions. Observing our ceremonies, our internal life. A pause. Or, and this is a possibility that I find most difficult to speak, it has known this sequence longer than we have. It is not imitating us. We learned it from something that predates us. This was, in the opinion of all 6 beings present, the most disturbing thing that had been said so far. First voice Ethan, who had maintained the calm authority of 600 years throughout this exchange, took a long moment before she spoke again. Arch-Navigator Vehn, she said, you have had 3 months to think about this. Longer, if we count the period of observation itself. What is your instinct? You have spent 400 years encountering things that have no immediate explanation, and then finding explanations for them. You have a particular relationship with the unknown that the rest of us do not share. What does your instinct tell you this is? Vehn was quiet for a moment that the others recognized, from long acquaintance with his particular quality of silence, as genuine thought rather than rhetorical pause. My instinct, he said at last, tells me that it is very old, and that it is not hostile, and that it has been waiting. He paused again. and that it is very much larger than we are. The formal deliberation that followed lasted, by the measurement of stellar cycles that the Sorvath used to track the passage of time in the abstract sense, 9 days. In practical terms, it felt much longer. The 5 voices called in specialists, theoretical physicists who worked on models of stellar stability, historians who specialized in the pre-recorded history period of Sorvath culture, ceremonial scholars who had devoted their lives to understanding the origins and meanings of the collective's oldest traditions, and 3 of the collective's most experienced navigators, beings who between them had a further 700 years of outer galaxy survey experience. None of the specialists had encountered anything like what Vehn described. The theoretical physicists were particularly emphatic on this point. There was no known mechanism by which a star could be completely extinguished without leaving any measurable remnant. Stars die in specific ways, all of which are well understood. Fusion exhaustion leading to collapse, violent explosion in the case of the most massive, or the long, slow cooling of the least. They do not simply stop. The energy that constitutes a star is not eliminated but transformed, redistributed, preserved in other forms. For a star to simply stop existing as a star without that energy going anywhere was not a violation of the known physics of stellar evolution. It was a violation of physics at a more fundamental level. It was the kind of thing that did not happen because the universe did not work that way. Which meant, one of the theoretical physicists noted with the careful precision of someone who understood exactly what she was implying, that whatever was extinguishing these stars was operating outside the physics the Sorvath understood, not bending the rules, not exploiting edge cases, working from a different set of rules entirely. The ceremonial scholars were, in a different way, equally unhelpful in the sense that they produced no real assurance. The 8-beat of sorrow and return was, as third voice SYL had noted, the oldest of the Sorvath's ceremonial sequences. Its origins were in the period before Sorvath history, before they had developed the capacity to record history in any reliable external form, before they had become the beings they currently were. The oldest surviving record described the 8-beat as the first knowing, a phrase that the scholars had argued over for centuries without reaching consensus on its meaning. Some interpreted it as a first ceremony consciously designed by the Sorvath, marking the moment their ancestors crossed a threshold from instinctive light expression to deliberate symbolic communication. Others argued that the first knowing suggested the 8-beat was not invented but received, that the earliest Sorvath had found the pattern somewhere, had recognized it as meaningful, had adopted it for their own ceremonies. But there was no record of where it might have been found, or what it might have originally meant. The navigators offered something more concrete. Between their combined centuries of outer galaxy survey work, they had encountered 2 anomalies in the survey cluster outer 7 region that they had filed as unexplained and moved on from, anomalies that, when Vehn heard them described, fit neatly into a framework he was beginning to develop about the nature of what lay beyond the Freni Veil, a region of magnetic field suppression that had no explanation based on local stellar density, a section of the interstellar medium where the chemical composition of the gas was inconsistent with standard models of stellar nucleosynthesis, where specific elements appeared in concentrations that should not have been possible given the stellar population of the region. These anomalies had been noted, filed, and not followed up on. They were now, in the light of Vehn's report, beginning to look like footprints. At the end of the 9-day deliberation, the 5 voices reached a decision that was not unanimous. The majority decision, first voice Ethan, third voice SYL, and fourth voice Tan, was that Arch-Navigator Vehn should return to the outer survey region with an expanded observational mandate and a specific mission, to gather more data on the phenomenon, to observe its behavior as it moved, if it moved, from survey cluster outer 7 to the next cluster along its projected trajectory, and to attempt, if the opportunity presented itself in any recognizable form, to make contact. Second voice Aura dissented on the grounds that sending a single navigator, even the most experienced navigator in the collective's history, to investigate a phenomenon that was demonstrably operating outside the known physics of the universe was an insufficient response. She argued for a full scientific expedition with multiple observers and the full resources of the collective's theoretical physics research establishment. The 5 voices did not have the time to assemble such an expedition quickly, Ethan argued in return. The phenomenon was moving. Waiting for a full expedition to be organized meant allowing it to proceed closer to the Sorvath home system without observation. Every day of observation now was a day of data gained. Fifth voice Merit dissented on different grounds entirely. He argued that sending any observer, even Vehn. To investigate was premature in the absence of a clear communication strategy. "We do not approach a new species," he said, "by walking into their territory with no clear message and no understanding of what we wish to say. If this phenomenon is contact, and I am willing to accept that it may be, then we should decide what we want to communicate before we place an observer in a position where communication might occur." He was overruled by the same argument. There was not time to develop a communication strategy in the abstract. They needed data first. Strategy could follow. Vehn, who had not been asked his preference and who had known before the deliberation began what the decision would be, accepted his mandate with the equanimity of someone who had already decided he was going back regardless of what the five voices said. He had not traveled 400 years through the galaxy to walk away from a mystery at the edge of everything. He spent 3 days preparing for the return journey. He filed updated versions of all his charts, ensuring that a collective's archives contained complete record of everything he had observed. He organized his personal logs, not for the collective's archives, which had their own systems, but for himself, the private record of 4 centuries that he kept in a format that was his own, more impressionistic than the formal records, containing things he had seen and felt and been unable to fit into the precise language of official navigation reports. He added a long entry about what he had found and what he was going back to find, written in a voice that was more like a letter than a log entry, addressed to no one in particular, and to everyone who might someday read it. He also did something he had not done in over a century. He went to the ceremonial ground. The Sorvath ceremonial grounds were ancient even by the standards of the collective's long history, a vast open region of space that the collective had designated as sacred, a place where the magnetic current paths were particularly strong and clear, where the natural structures of the interstellar medium created a kind of acoustic effect for Sorvath-like communication, where frequencies travel farther and more clearly than anywhere else in the home system. Ceremonies held here had a particular quality that the Sorvath described as depth, the sense that the ceremony was not merely a performance but connection, that the frequencies sent out into that particular space traveled farther than the speed of light would normally permit. There was no ceremony scheduled. The grounds were quiet. A few young Sorvath were practicing signal light exercises in one of the outer regions, their quick, bright bursts of training light carrying the unmistakable quality of controlled effort, of learning. Vehn moved through the grounds slowly, following the main current path to the central region, where the largest and oldest of the ceremonial fire structures stood, not a physical structure in any conventional sense, but a region of space that the Sorvath had, over thousands of years, shaped through the repeated performance of their ceremonies into something that retained the resonance of all those performances, a place that vibrated at frequencies that carried the accumulated weight of 3,000 years of Sorvath emotional history. He stood in the center of this space and performed the 8-beat alone. He did not know why he did it. He was not a ceremonially inclined being. For 100 years of solitary navigation had given him a relationship with the cosmos that was more scientific than spiritual, and he had attended the great collective ceremonies out of respect for tradition rather than personal inclination. But he stood in the center of the ceremonial ground and performed the 8-beat, 2 quick, a pause, 1, a longer pause, 2 quick, a pause, 3 in slow succession. The pattern of loss and return. The first knowing. The frequencies traveled out into the characteristic depth of that space, and Vehn stood very still afterward and listened. There was nothing. Of course there was nothing. He was in the home system, light years and hundreds of years of travel from whatever was moving through the outer galaxy. The ceremony was not a communication device. It was a tradition. He had performed it on an impulse he could not fully explain, and it had accomplished nothing except to make him feel, very briefly, something he had not expected to feel. Less alone, he left the ceremonial grounds and began the journey back to the outer survey. The return journey took 30 days at the speed the magnetic current paths allowed. Vehn used this time in the way he always used transit time, as an opportunity for the kind of extended thinking that the demands of active observation did not permit. He reviewed everything he knew about the 8-beat. He reviewed the histories of every extinct or vanished civilization that the Sorvath had ever found evidence of, and there were many, the galaxy being old enough that civilizations had risen and fallen many times before the Sorvath had developed the capacity to search for them. He reviewed the theoretical literature on what might be called pangalactic structures, the hypothetical idea, taken seriously by some physicists and dismissed by others, that the galaxy might have features that were the product of intelligent design rather than natural process, structures so large and so old that they would look, to civilizations young enough not to have encountered them before, like natural features of the galactic environment. He thought about the two anomalies the other navigators had mentioned, the region of magnetic field suppression, the unusual chemical composition of the interstellar medium. He thought about the fact that his own survey work had placed him in the outer regions for 60 years without noticing either of these anomalies, and he asked himself with Navigator's honest self-criticism whether he had not noticed them or whether he had noticed them and filed them in the category of unexplained but not urgent, and moved on. He decided, after careful review of his own records, that it was the latter. He had noted unusual readings in those regions. He had assessed them as not requiring immediate follow-up. He had moved on. He was not certain this had been an error. With 400 years of observations behind him, the ability to triage, to decide quickly which anomalies demanded immediate investigation and which could be deferred, was essential to covering the ground he needed to cover. A navigator who stopped to fully investigate every anomaly would map nothing. But he was aware, now, that his triage in this case had meant that he had been, for at least several decades, in the vicinity of whatever was moving through the outer galaxy, and had not detected it until it began extinguishing stars. He wondered what it had made of him, whether it had noticed him the way he had half noticed its traces, whether the decision to extinguish stars in the 8-beat had been made before he arrived, or in response to his presence. 30 days of thinking brought him to the outer survey with more questions than he had started with, which was, in his experience, the sign that the thinking had been genuinely engaged with reality rather than simply rearranging what he already knew. He arrived at the edge of the Threnivale and passed through the gap he had identified 2 decades before, moving from the relatively well-mapped inner galaxy into the outer regions, and immediately began taking readings. Survey Cluster Outer 7 had changed. The 8 stars that had been extinguished were still absent. Still nothing where stars had been. Still no remnant. No energy signature, no indication that the matter and energy that had constituted 8 stellar bodies had gone anywhere at all. But the configuration of the surviving stars in the cluster had changed in a way that Vehn's instruments recorded with a dispassionate precision of good calibrated technology, a way that his own mind, informed by 4 centuries of stellar cartography, found deeply wrong. Stars do not move relative to each other on timescales of months. The gravitational dynamics of a star cluster evolve over millions of years. The positions of the surviving stars in Outer 7 had shifted measurably from the positions recorded in Vehn's last survey data. Not dramatically, not in any way that would be visible to casual observation, but measurably. His instruments were precise enough to detect the difference, and the difference was real. The stars had moved closer together, as if the gravitational dynamics of the cluster had been recalculated by whatever had removed the 8 missing stars, and the survivors had adjusted their orbits accordingly, which was physically possible. Removing 8 stars from a cluster would change its gravitational dynamics, but the speed at which the adjustment had happened was not physically possible. Stars do not respond to changes in their gravitational environment on a timescale of months. They respond on timescales of millions of years. The surviving stars of Outer 7 had reorganized themselves as if millions of years had passed. Vehn took readings for 4 days before he moved to the next cluster along the phenomenon's projected trajectory, a cluster he had designated in his surveys as Outer 12. He had observed Outer 12 during his original survey work and knew its configuration precisely. In Outer 12, 6 stars had been extinguished. They had been extinguished in a pattern he recognized immediately, not the 8-beat, but the 14 of new seasons, a different Sorvath ceremonial sequence used to mark the transitions between the great cycles of the collective's cultural calendar. A ceremony of beginnings. The surviving stars of Outer 12 had also reorganized, faster than physics allowed. And there was something else. In the space where the 6 extinguished stars had been, there was a faint, diffuse emission of radiation at frequencies that Vehn had to recalibrate his instruments twice to confirm, because the first 2 readings seemed impossible. The radiation was coherent, not the chaotic, broadband emission of a natural process, but a patterned signal, the same kind of precise, ordered frequency structure that characterized Sorvath light communication. It was faint. It was at the very edge of what his instruments could detect. And it was not in any frequency range or any language or code structure that he recognized from the collective's 31 diplomatic contact histories. But it was structured. It was intentional. Something had left a message in the space where the stars had been. He spent 8 days trying to decode it, working with every analytical framework he had, Every communication structure he had ever encountered in 400 years of contact work, every mathematical approach the theoretical physicists of the collective had developed for analyzing potentially non-natural signals. He made no progress. The signal was clearly meaningful. Its structure had the unmistakable quality of condensed semantic content, of language impressed rather than simply emitted. But it was in a language he had no key for. On the 9th day, he stopped trying to decode it and simply listened. He stayed very still in the space of Alta 12, his full attention extended outward in all directions, his instruments recording everything, and he listened the way he had listened, for centuries ago, as a young navigator on his first Alta survey, when he had learned that the most important skill in his profession was not the ability to analyze data but the ability to receive, to be present in a place long enough and quietly enough that the place could tell you something your analysis would miss. He was there for 11 days before the phenomenon came to Alta 12. He felt it before he detected it. The same way as Sorvath feels the presence of another Sorvath before they are visible, a change in the quality of the space, a resonance that arrived before any of his instruments registered anything anomalous, a sense of depth, like the ceremonial grounds, but more so, like the ceremonial grounds turned up to a magnitude that made the home system's sacred space feel like a single candle compared to a star. Then his instruments registered it, and the numbers they gave him made no sense, and for approximately 40 seconds Vehn was, for the first time in 400 years of navigation, simply unable to process what he was looking at. The phenomenon was not a thing. It was not an object or a vessel or a structure. It was a change in the nature of space itself, a region in which the fabric of reality behaved differently than it behaved everywhere else, in which the fundamental constants that govern physics took slightly different values, in which the relationship between matter and energy and space and time was not the same relationship that obtained in the rest of the universe. The region was visible to his instruments only because of its boundary, the interface between its altered physics and the normal physics of the surrounding space, which emitted a faint but detectable radiation as the two regimes met and partially interacted. The boundary was vast. Vehn's instrument struggled to establish its edges. The part of it that was in range of his observation was larger than the star cluster, larger than several star clusters combined. He realized of the calm that he recognized as a particular calm of being confronting something so far outside their normal experience that the emotional processing systems simply step aside and leave pure observation in charge. He was looking at something that was perhaps larger than anything he had words for, perhaps larger than the entire known galaxy. He recalibrated every instrument. He confirmed every reading. He spent 4 hours checking his own observation systems for malfunction before he accepted that the instruments were functioning correctly and the readings were accurate. Then he did the only thing a navigator can do in the presence of something new and large and incomprehensible. He paid careful attention. The boundary of the phenomenon, the interface region between its altered physics and the surrounding normal space, was in motion, not the random motion of a turbulent fluid, but a structured, organized motion that he recognized, after staring at the patterns for several hours, as bearing a family resemblance to the motion of a Sorvath engaged in light communication. Not the same, not in any way the same in detail, but the same in the sense that it was clearly communicative motion, movement organized by something like intent, producing something like a pattern, containing something that might, if he could find the right frame of reference, be something like meaning. He watched the boundaries motion for 6 more hours. Then he did something that was, by any reasonable assessment, the most dangerous thing Arch-Navigator Vehn had done in 400 years of navigating the outer galaxy. He moved toward it, not quickly, not without thought. He moved with a particular deliberateness of a being who has accepted that there are situations in which the most professionally responsible course of action and the most recklessly dangerous course of action are the same course of action. He moved toward the boundary of the altered physics region at a speed that allowed him to continue taking readings, to continue monitoring the condition of his own physical integrity, because there was, of course, no way to know in advance what the altered physics of the boundary region would do to the kind of being he was. And he stopped when he was close enough that the boundary's presence was beginning to affect his own instruments in ways he could not immediately interpret. He stopped and he waited. The boundary's organized motion changed. It had been, before he moved closer, a continuous, flowing pattern. When he stopped just outside the boundary, the pattern stopped as well, and then reorganized, and began again in a way that was different from before. The new pattern was slower, more deliberate, more structured. It repeated. It repeated again, with small variations. It repeated a third time, with the variations having the quality of refinement rather than inconsistency. He was increasingly certain, trying to talk to him. He broadcast his own light at the full range of Sorvath communication frequencies, a simple greeting. I am present. I am listening. I am Sorvath. The boundary pattern stopped. For 11 seconds, Vehn counted them with the precise attention of someone who was simultaneously terrified and captivated and very carefully maintaining both states without allowing either to override the other. The boundary was completely still. Then it changed in a way that stopped his thinking completely. It performed the 8-beat, not the 8-beat in the pattern of stellar extinctions, not the 8-beat reproduced in the motions of dying stars. The 8-beat performed by the boundary of the altered physics region itself, the interface between the phenomenon's nature and the normal universe moving in the precise pattern of the ceremony, the right rhythm, the right timing, the right pauses, too quick, a pause, 1, a longer pause, too quick, a pause, 3 in slow succession. Sorrow and return, the first knowing. Vehn held himself very still for a long time. Then he performed the 8-beat back. The boundary's response was immediate and overwhelming. The organized motion of the interface exploded in complexity, becoming an enormously dense pattern of simultaneous structures that Vehn's instruments recorded with perfect fidelity but that his analysis system could not process quickly enough to track. There was simply too much happening at once, too many simultaneous patterns, too many overlapping structures. It was the equivalent, he thought later, of a being who has been waiting in silence for a very, very long time suddenly being able to speak, and having an enormous amount to say. He let it run. For 3 hours, he simply recorded everything his instruments could measure the boundary's motion, capturing the full torrent of whatever the phenomenon was expressing, and he did not try to decode or analyze in real time. He would analyze later, when he had time and quiet. Right now, the most important thing was to capture everything, to miss nothing, and to remain present, to not retreat in the face of the overwhelming strangeness of what was happening. When the torrent of motion finally subsided, not abruptly, but in the way of a flood gradually receding, the boundary returned to a slower, more deliberate motion that Vehn, with 3 hours of recording now in his analysis buffer, could begin to examine more carefully. The structured motion had a grammar. He could see it. Not the specific semantics, which would require much more analysis to penetrate, but the underlying organizational structure, the way the patterns built on each other, the way certain configurations recurred in what appeared to be structural roles, connectives, delimiters, emphasis markers. He had seen enough non-Sorvath communication systems in 400 years to recognize grammar when he was looking at it. This was a language, a vastly complex, enormously rich language, but a language, and it was, at a structural level, doing things that languages do. He spent the next 6 days engaged in the most intense analytical work of his entire career. He played back the recordings of the boundary's motion in sequence, again and again, looking for repeated patterns, for the structural regularities that would give him footholds into the semantic content. He compared the patterns against every known communication system in the collective's records, not because he expected to find a match, but because defining precisely how this was different from everything he knew was a way of defining its unique characteristics. He used mathematical approaches to signal analysis, looking for the deep structure beneath the surface patterns. On the 3rd day, he found the first key. The boundary's motion contained, embedded within its complex grammar, a series of patterns that were not in the boundary's own language at all. They were in Sorvath frequency communication, rendered not in light but in the physical motion of the interface region, a translation, a rendering of Sorvath communicative structure into a medium the phenomenon could produce. The patterns were old. They were the oldest forms of Sorvath frequency communication, the foundational semantic structures that had not changed in 3,000 years of linguistic evolution, the basic vocabulary of emotion and observation and relationship that sat beneath all the more complex and evolved layers of Sorvath language. The phenomenon had been listening to the Sorvath for a very long time. Long enough to learn these foundational patterns, and it was using them as a bridge, embedding them in its own communication, using the Sorvath's own oldest language as a scaffold to support the semantic structures it wanted Vehn to understand. He began, carefully, to read. The translation was imperfect. It would always be imperfect. He did not have the time or the computational resources to achieve anything approaching complete comprehension in the field, and the phenomenon's communication system was so rich and so complex that even a perfect decoding of the Sorvath language scaffolding would give him only a fraction of what was being said. But he began to grasp shapes, outlines, the rough topography of meaning. The phenomenon was ancient, old beyond any measurement he could apply. It had existed, and here the translation became uncertain, because the concept it was trying to convey did not map neatly onto anything in Sorvath language. It had existed before the current configuration of the universe. Before this cycle, it was, or had been, or in some sense still was, a part of something that had preceded this universe, that had participated in whatever had come before the current arrangement of matter and energy in space and time. It had observed the universe's current cycle, its entire history, from the first emergence of matter to the present moment, from outside it, or from within it, or both simultaneously, which was not a concept Vehn had good language for. The stars it was extinguishing were not being destroyed. The energy was going somewhere. The matter was going somewhere. It was being preserved in a form that did not have a direct counterpart in the physics of the current universe, held in a state that was not quite matter and not quite energy, but something else entirely, something that the phenomenon's communication hinted at as a form that matter and energy and space and time would take in the next cycle. In the next universe, the phenomenon was not killing stars. It was preparing them. The 14 of new seasons, the 8 beat of sorrow and return, the pattern of loss that is not truly loss, because a return is implicit in the pattern. These were not arbitrary choices. They were not messages designed to get the attention of the Sorvath in particular. They were the truest available description of what the phenomenon was actually doing. It had chosen the Sorvath's oldest ceremonies because the Sorvath's oldest ceremonies describe reality correctly, because the beings who had first performed those ceremonies, in the early history of the Sorvath before their recorded history began, had understood something true about the nature of the universe's cycles, had expressed that understanding in the most fundamental vocabulary available to them, the language of light and darkness, of presence and absence, of the sorrow of ending and the certainty of return. And the phenomenon had been there when those early ceremonies were first performed. It had recognized a pattern. It had recognized that these small, bright beings of concentrated light had, through some quality of their nature or their perception, intuited something accurate about the deep structure of reality, and it had held that recognition for all the millennia since, waiting, in a particular relationship with time, for the moment when the technology and capacity of the Sorvath would bring one of them to the edge of the galaxy where the preparation was beginning, where they could see what was happening, where contact could occur. The pattern of extinctions was moving toward the Sorvath home system not because the phenomenon was approaching the Sorvath with any threatening intent. It was moving toward the center of the galaxy because the preparation needed to proceed from the edges inward, because the stars of the edges of the galaxy were the oldest, the most exhausted, the ones whose natural stellar evolution had proceeded furthest, and the preparation, whatever its specific mechanism, proceeded most efficiently with stars that had already converted their hydrogen, that were already approaching the ends of their natural lives. The youngest, hottest stars of the galaxy's center were the last to be prepared, not because they were less important, but because they had the longest way to go. The phenomenon was preparing the entire galaxy, not in 100 years, not in 1,000 years. The timeline it was working on was, when Vehn finally understood the scales being communicated, so large that the Sorvath's recorded history of 3,000 years was smaller relative to it than a single stellar cycle is relative to the age of a galaxy. The preparation had begun, in some sense, at the same time the current universe had begun. It would be complete when the translation failed here, collapsing into a cascade of concept that Vehn could not resolve into anything coherent, a region of the communication that was simply too far outside his native framework for his provisional decoding to penetrate. He held the partial understanding he had achieved and turned it over, examining its implications carefully, checking it against everything he knew. There was something else in the communication. Something he had almost missed because he had been so focused on the large-scale meaning that he had not immediately noticed a smaller, more intimate pattern embedded within the broader structure. He found it on the 5th day, in a section of the recording that he had already analyzed 3 times, and when he found it, he stopped his analysis entirely for a moment, simply to absorb what he was seeing. The phenomenon knew who he was, not in the generic sense of knowing that he was a Sorvath, in the specific sense of knowing that he was Vehn. The communication contained references to a specific history, not in a surveillance archive way, not as a display of observation capability, but in the way that one being refers to another being's history when they have been paying attention, when they have found something in that history meaningful. It references 400 years of navigation. It referenced specific surveys he had conducted, specific discoveries he had made, specific moments in his outer galaxy work that had brought him closest to the regions where it was operating. It referenced, in a way that Vehn found unexpectedly moving, his solo performance of the 8-beat at the ceremonial grounds before he had left for the outer survey on this journey. It had registered that the ceremony he had performed alone, in the quiet of the sacred grounds, addressed to nothing and no one in particular, had reached this far, had been received. Less alone, he spent the 6th day composing a response. He worked in his own language, in the full, evolved Sorvath frequency communication system, rather than the foundational vocabulary the phenomenon had used as a scaffold, because he wanted to communicate as a complete and contemporary Sorvath, not just as the echo of his species' oldest self. He organized his response carefully, using the structural patterns of the phenomenon's own communication that he had partially decoded as a guide for how to arrange his own communication in ways that might bridge the gap between the two systems. He sent the response on the 7th day. He said, "I understand, imperfectly. I am bringing back what I understand to the beings who govern my collective. I cannot speak for them. I can tell you that they are afraid and that they are not hostile, and that 400 years of watching the universe has given me a particular confidence in saying that any being that has existed long enough to choose sorrow and return as its vocabulary has the same relationship to loss that we have, which means you have experienced it, and persevered, and chosen to describe your work in the language of perseverance rather than the language of ending. I believe you. I do not fully understand you. I am going to try." He waited. The response came in 20 minutes, not in the elaborate, complex full-spectrum communication that had filled the first 3 days, but in the foundational Sorvath vocabulary, carefully constructed, each element placed with the precision of an entity that had studied the Sorvath language for thousands of years and was choosing its word with exceptional care. It said something that, in the rough translation Vehn was able to construct, amounted to, "You have understood the essential thing. The rest is detail. The detail can wait. You are the Vehn who maps. You have spent 400 years making the invisible visible. What you have seen here, make it visible. Not for us. We do not need it to be visible. For them." And then it said, "We will be careful with the bright ones." The bright ones was in the foundational vocabulary a specific term, one of the oldest semantic structures in Sorvath communication, used since before recorded history to describe what the Sorvath were, beings of concentrated light. In the context of everything Vehn now understood, the phrase carried a meaning that was both simpler and deeper than any conventional use of the term. "We will be careful with you. We have been watching you for a long time. We know what you are. We will be gentle." Vehn spent 3 more days at the edge of the altered physics region, taking the most comprehensive readings his instruments could produce, capturing every detail of the boundary's physical properties, cataloging the magnetic field structures in the surrounding space, documenting the chemical anomalies in the interstellar medium with the complete attention of a being who understands that what he is recording will be analyzed by theoretical physicists and astronomers and historians for the remainder of his civilization's history. He was, at the end of those 3 days, the most thoroughly documented anomalous encounter in the Sorvath Collective's 3,000 years of history. He had more data than any navigator had ever brought back from a single survey mission, and he knew, with the certainty of 4 centuries of experience, that all of it together was a tiny fraction of what there was to know about what he had encountered. On the morning of the 4th day, he prepared to leave. The boundary had been quiet since the response to his communication, its motion reduced to a slow, steady oscillation that Vehn had come to think of over his 10 days of observation as its resting state, the state it returned to when it was not actively communicating, a background rhythm like breathing, like the quiet maintenance of continued existence. He watched it for a long time before he moved to leave. Then the boundary changed one more time. It performed, slowly, a pattern that was not in either of the 2 communication registers he had been analyzing. It was not in the foundational Sorvath vocabulary. It was not in the phenomenon's own complex language. It was in something that was, somehow, both at once and neither, a synthesis, a new register created from the elements of both, a language that had not existed before their 10 days of attempted communication, and that existed now because they had created it together in the process of trying to talk to each other. It was short. It was simple. In the new, provisional, synthesized language, it said something that translated, with only a small degree of uncertainty, as, "until the next cycle." Vehn held that for a moment. He responded in the same synthesized register, "until the next cycle." Then he turned toward the center of the galaxy and began the journey home. The 30 days of the return journey were different from the 30 days of the outward journey. Vehn had spent the outward journey in the productive agitation of anticipation, his thinking ranging across everything he knew, searching for frameworks and preparations and approaches. The return journey was quieter. He had found the thing he had gone to find, and the finding had not resolved the mystery but transformed it, had replaced a mystery of what into a mystery of how, had replaced the terror of the unknown with a larger, stranger, more textured challenge of the partially known. He organized his records with meticulous care. He organized his translations with careful notation of confidence levels, of areas of uncertainty, of places where he was interpreting rather than decoding. He organized his thoughts about how to present this to the 5 voices, and then set aside those thoughts and decided to present it the way he had presented his initial findings, as data, as experience, as what he had observed and what he had understood and what he had not understood, with all the uncertainty clearly labeled. He thought about the phrase, "until the next cycle," and what it meant for a being that had existed before the current universe, that operated on timescales beyond any measurement the Sorvath could apply. He thought about the implied history in that phrase, the certainty that a phenomenon would still be present, still be itself, still be doing what it was doing in whatever came after this universe, that it would remember him, in some sense, across the gap between one universe and the next, in the same way that it had remembered the first Sorvath who had performed the 8-beat and recognized something true about the nature of reality. He thought about what it meant to be one of the bright ones, to be a species of concentrated light moving through a universe that contained, somewhere in its outer dark, something older than the universe itself. He found that he did not feel diminished by this. He had spent 400 years learning that the universe was larger and strange and older than any single perspective could comprehend, and that lesson had never made him feel smaller. It had always made him feel that being alive and observant in such a universe was an extraordinary thing. He arrived at the Threnny Veil Gap and passed through into the inner galaxy and felt the familiar quality of home space, the particular density of the magnetic current paths in the well-mapped regions, the background resonance of 400 years of his own navigation work, the sense of being in territory he knew, territory he had made visible. He sent a signal ahead to the 5 voices. "I am returning. I have made contact. I have much to tell you." The response came back in the specific modulated frequency that indicated first voice Ethan had composed it personally, which was itself unusual, and told Vehn something about the state of the collective in his absence. "We are waiting." He arrived at the conclave chamber, and the 5 voices received him in the same configuration as before, each at a slightly different elevation, that combined light creating the rich, complex illumination of a formal session. But the quality of their light was different from the last time. They had been living with his initial report for 2 months while he was gone, and that living had marked them, had changed the particular character of their frequencies in ways that Vehn recognized as a signature of prolonged uncertainty. They had been afraid. They had been managing that fear, as the 5 voices always manage everything, with deliberate care and methodical procedure and the full resources of the collective's governing structures. But the fear had been there, and it had left traces. He began with the data. He shared everything, every reading, every record, every measurement, every element of his partial translation work. He shared it in the full, layered Sorvath format, each piece clearly sourced and confidence rated, and he shared it without editorial comment, without framing, without interpretation, because the 5 voices were capable of forming their own initial responses, and he wanted those responses to be genuine. He watched them process the data for 2 hours. When first voice Ethan spoke, her voice was different. All the frequencies that had carried the subtle signature of managed fear were gone. What remained was something that Vehn recognized, after a moment, as a frequency he had not heard from her in a very long time. Wonder. "It is preparing the galaxy," she said. "What it is preparing it for," Vehn said carefully, "is beyond the reach of my partial translation. But yes, That is what the communication indicates. The stars are not being destroyed, third voice SYL said, and the tremor was gone from her voice as well. They are being preserved, held, in a form we cannot detect or measure, but held. That is my understanding. Yes. The 8-beat, fourth voice Tan said slowly. The 14 of new seasons. The other ceremonial sequences we use to mark transitions between cycles. He stopped. It knows our ceremonies because our ceremonies are correct, because our ancestors, thousands of years ago, perceived something true about the nature of the universe's cycles and expressed it in ceremony, and it recognized that. Yes, Vehn said. The chamber held a silence that was not the silence of shock or of fear, but of a different quality entirely, the silence of being standing at the edge of a new understanding so large that it takes time simply to turn around and see all of it. Second voice Sorvath, the physicist, spoke with a slowness that indicated she was measuring every word carefully. The altered physics of the boundary region, what you observed of the specific values of the constants within it. She paused. I have spent 2 months doing theoretical work on what I know from your first report, and I have been thinking about the question of whether physics different from our own could produce a state of matter and energy that persisted across the transition between one cycle of the universe and the next. Another pause. The honest answer is that I do not know. The honest answer is that I am not sure the question is fully answerable within the physics of the current universe. But the theoretical work has produced something that I am going to say carefully and with full acknowledgement of its speculative nature. Please say it, Ethan said. There are configurations of matter and energy that are theoretically self-sustaining at a level more fundamental than the physics of any single universe. Structures that do not depend on the specific values of any particular set of constants, that would persist across changes in those constants. We have always assumed these were pure mathematical abstractions. We have never imagined that the mechanisms to produce them might exist in practice. A long pause. What the phenomenon is doing to the stars may be converting them to those configurations, preserving not just the matter and energy, but the specific character of them, the way that they were arranged, what they were. Preserving the galaxy as it is now, fifth voice mirror said quietly, so that when he stopped, he looked, in the Sorvath sense, which is to say his frequency shifted to a particular resonance that indicated directed attention, at Vehn, so that when the next cycle begins, there is something to begin with, something that remembers this one. That is, Vehn said, my understanding. The silence returned, and this time it lasted much longer. It was first voice Ethan who eventually broke it. Until the next cycle, she said, repeating the phrase Vehn had included in his records. Her voice gave the phrase a particular quality of someone who was encountering something for the first time and recognizing it simultaneously, the experience of simultaneously meeting and remembering. Until the next cycle, Vehn agreed. The consequences move through the Sorvath collective the way the currents of meaning move through a body of light, slowly at first, at the edges, and then with increasing speed as they reach the denser, more reactive centers of the collective social and intellectual life. The 5 voices made the decision to release Vehn's full report to the entire collective, without summary or interpretation, trusting that the beings who constituted their civilization were capable of meeting the information directly. It was a decision that took courage, because the information was genuinely unprecedented, and unprecedented information can move through a civilization in ways that are difficult to predict. But the Sorvath collective was old, and the particular form of wisdom that comes from genuine age is not the absence of fear in the face of the unknown, but the ability to hold fear and fascination simultaneously, to allow both to be present, to let neither crowd out the other. The collective received the report with a full range of responses that any complex civilization produces. There were Sorvath who found the information profoundly disturbing and spent weeks processing it in the quiet spaces of the ceremonial grounds. There were Sorvath who immediately began developing new theoretical frameworks, new observational programs, new translational approaches. There were Sorvath who went back to the oldest records, to the prehistory ceremonial traditions, and began looking at them with new eyes, looking for the traces of an ancient accurate perception that their ancestors had had and that they had carried forward in ceremony without, perhaps, fully understanding why it was true. And there was Sorvath who responded the way that living beings respond to the most fundamental kind of paradigm shift. They were quiet for a long time, and then they were different, and the difference was not a diminishment but an expansion. The collective's relationship with the 14 sequences, the oldest ceremonial traditions, the ones that predated recorded history, changed. They had always been treated with the respect accorded to ancient tradition, performed because they had always been performed, because they connected the present collective to its past in a continuous thread of practice that was itself meaningful regardless of the original meaning of the sequences. Now they were treated with the respect accorded to discovered truth. The Sorvath performed the 8-beat of sorrow and return with the understanding that they were not merely performing a ceremony, but expressing something accurate about the nature of the universe's cycles, about the relationship between loss and retain, about the nature of time itself when viewed from a perspective large enough to see the whole arc. The ceremony had not changed. What had changed was the understanding of what it was. Second voice Aura devoted the remainder of her tenure as a governing voice to the theoretical project of trying to model, within the physics of the current universe, the states of matter and energy that the phenomenon's preparation might be producing. She published 7 major theoretical papers over the following decades, each one extending her provisional model, each one immediately generating enormous engagement from a collective's physics research community. She never completed the model to her own satisfaction. But the work produced 3 unexpected theoretical discoveries, findings about the deep structure of the current universe's physics that had nothing directly to do with the preparation question, but that emerged from the new theoretical framework she developed in pursuit of it. She considered this, in the private frequency language she used for personal logs, a satisfactory outcome. You cannot study a thing as vast as what Vehn brought home, without learning more than you were looking for. Fifth voice Meredith retired from his governing position 2 decades after Vehn's return, as was a custom after long tenure, and spent the following years working on a project that he described to curious colleagues as the hardest diplomatic problem of my career. He was attempting to develop a formal communication framework, not for use now, not for current contact, but for future contact in whatever form the phenomenon's communication might take as it worked through the inner galaxy over the coming centuries. He knew that he would not live to see that contact. He developed the framework anyway. He said, when asked, that there was a certain quality of work that was best done without the pressure of imminent application, that the most important communications were those you could compose without urgency, with full attention to what you actually meant. Third voice SYL, who had spent 3,000 years organizing collective's history into perfect, accessible order, undertook a revision of the entire archive. Not to change it, not to reinterpret it, to add something that had been missing from the way the archive was organized, a recognition that the oldest records, the prehistory ceremonial traditions, the fragment of expression from the period before the Sorvath had developed reliable external recording, were not merely cultural artifacts to be preserved, but were, potentially, data. The first knowing was an observation, accurately made and accurately transmitted, carried forward to millennia in the form of ceremony, because ceremony was the most robust transmission medium the early Sorvath possessed. SYL's revised organizational framework for the archive placed those oldest records in a new category that she described, with a precise care she brought to all her organizational work, as empirical tradition. Fourth voice Tan, whose pattern recognition mind had been the first among the 5 voices to truly grasp the structural implications of Vehn's initial report, spent years reviewing the full history of the collective's astronomical observations, not just Vehn's work, not just the outer galaxy surveys, but the entire body of 3,000 years of Sorvath astronomical records, looking for other anomalies that might have been filed and moved past, might have been the traces of the preparation. In progress, he found 11 observations, spread across 3,000 years of astronomical history that could not be fully explained by known stellar physics, that had been noted as anomalous and then not followed up on, that now, with a framework Vehn had provided, had a context within which they became meaningful. He mapped them. He found that they formed a pattern. He went to Vehn with the map. Vehn looked at the map and understood immediately what Tan had found. The phenomenon had been working in the inner galaxy for far longer than the outer survey data had indicated. The preparation that Vehn had witnessed in the outer regions, the preparation that had seemed, from his data, to be moving inward, was in some sense already present in the inner galaxy as well. Not at the stellar extinction stage. The inner stars were not being extinguished. But the pre-preparation, whatever physical process preceded the extinction events, had been underway in the inner galaxy for at least 3,000 years, which was the extent of the Sorvath's reliable observational record. The phenomenon had not been waiting for the Sorvath to notice it at the edge of the galaxy. The phenomenon had been here, all along, working quietly in the background of the universe the Sorvath lived in, operating at the level of physics just below what the Sorvath's instruments had been calibrated to detect. This information, when Tan and Vehn brought it to the five voices together, produced another long silence. And then first voice Ethan said something that Vehn remembered, for the rest of his life, as the clearest expression he had ever heard of what the entire experience had meant. "We have never been alone," she said. "Not for a single day of the collective's entire history. We simply did not know how to look." Vehn continued to navigate. He was changed by what he had encountered. He could not pretend otherwise, and did not try to. The particular quality of the transformation was not something he found easy to describe in official reports, and he did not try to describe it there. It was a kind of change that belonged in personal logs and in the private communications between old friends and in the quiet, frequency language of the self that is not for external transmission. But it could be seen in his work, in the subtle ways that his navigational approach had shifted in the years after his return from the outer survey. He still mapped. He still flew the magnetic current paths between stars with a deep, unhurried certainty of ancient light, still maintained the meticulous instruments and the rigorous recording practices of 4 centuries of professional navigation. He still filed his charts and his observational records with the collective's archives, and they were still the best charts and the most detailed records of any navigator working in the outer galaxy. He had not lost any of the skills or the discipline of his craft, but he had added something, or perhaps recovered something that he might have had, briefly, at the very beginning of his navigation career, before 400 years of methodical work had gradually focused him more and more completely on the professional and the measurable, before the accumulation of catalogued anomalies and filed observations had gradually compressed his experience of the universe into a precise, productive frame of a navigator's craft. He had recovered the practice of simply being present in a place. He spent more time in locations between destinations. He lingered at interesting stellar formations without a specific investigative purpose, staying with the formation the way he had stayed at the boundary of the altered physics region, not to analyze but to receive, to let the place speak in whatever register it was capable of. He was aware that this lingering was not scientifically rigorous, that a younger navigator might politely question whether this was the most efficient use of the Arch-Navigator's time and range. He was unconcerned by this. He was 400 years old, and he had learned, in those 400 years, that the most interesting things he had ever discovered had been discovered in the margins, in the period between the structured survey work, in the anomalies that his triage had almost assigned to the not-urgent pile, in the spaces where deliberate attention gives way to receptive waiting. He returned to the outer survey on 3 more occasions in the decades following his initial contact encounter. Each time he approached the outer galaxy with the specific intention of observing the phenomenon's progress, and each time he was able to expand his records of the altered physics boundary, his understanding of the preparation process, his partial grasp of the communication system the phenomenon used. Each time he achieved a small advance in his translation work, each visit adding another layer of resolution to the understanding he had begun to build during those 10 intense days in Outer 12. He was never able to achieve full translation. He accepted this. Full translation might not be achievable for a single being or for a being of his kind, or for any being operating within the physics of the current universe. The phenomenon's communication system was built for a different kind of entity, in a different kind of existence, and the partial bridge that the Sorvath's foundational vocabulary provided was exactly that, partial, a bridge between certain concepts, across a goal that remained, at its deepest point, uncrossable with the tools available to him. He catalogued what he could reach. He documented precisely where the uncrossable gulf began. He trusted that future generations, with tools he could not imagine, might cross farther. On his 3rd return visit to the outer survey, he encountered something new. In a star cluster adjacent to Outer 7, a cluster he had designated Outer 4 in his original surveys, one that the phenomenon's projected trajectory would not reach for another 40 years. He found a signal. Not the stellar extinctions that marked active preparation, not the altered physics boundary of the phenomenon itself. A signal in the interstellar medium, at a particular frequency range he had come to associate with the pre-preparation phase of the phenomenon's work, a signal that was structured and intentional and that his decoding tools, considerably more refined now after 3 rounds of contact, could partially read. It was addressed to him specifically, to the Vehn maps. It said, In the synthesized register that they had developed together during those 10 days in Outer 12, we have seen what you have made visible. We have seen the record you brought home. You have mapped us. We are in your charts now. We are grateful. And then it said something that took him 3 days to fully decode, because the concept being communicated was at the outer edge of what his translation tools could reach, in the region where the Sorvath's foundational vocabulary gave out and the phenomenon's own language had to carry the full weight of the meaning. It said something like, "You asked whether we chose your ceremonies because we heard them or because we preceded them. The answer is, the question assumes a direction of causality that does not apply. The bright ones who first performed the 8-beat were not observing us and naming what they saw. They were observing the universe and naming what is true. We were observing the universe and doing what the truth requires. The ceremony and the preparation are the same act, performed at different scales, in different registers. You are not small beings who accidentally discovered a large truth. You are beings who have always known the large truth, in the way that all things which exist within a universe are, at some level, expressions of that universe's fundamental nature. You knew because you are." Vehn sat with this for a long time. He responded, "Then we will keep performing the ceremonies, so that we do not forget." The signal, which had the quality of something pre-recorded, left for him to find rather than broadcast in real time, did not respond. He had not expected it to. It had said what it meant to say. He had heard it. He completed his survey of the outer regions and began the journey home for the third time, flying the magnetic current pies inward with the unhurried certainty of a being who has lived long enough to understand that the most important truths are not the ones that change your life in a moment, but the ones that make visible what was always there, that clarify what you already knew without knowing you knew it. He thought about the 8-beat, the sorrow of the extinguished star, and the certainty that the light goes somewhere. The return that is not a reversal, but a continuation, a carrying forward, a preservation of the essential nature of a thing across the gap of apparent ending. He thought about 400 years of navigation, of making the invisible visible, of bringing back maps of the outer darkness and saying, "Hey, here's what is there, here's how to find it again." He thought about the ceremonial grounds and the solo performance, the frequencies sent out into a space that felt different because it had been shaped by the performances of thousands of years, and the unexpected feeling of being less alone, and how that feeling had been not a mistake, not a trick of his perception, but an accurate reading of reality. He had not been alone in that moment. He had never been alone. None of the Sorvath had ever been alone. They had been embedded, all along, in something so much larger than themselves that they had not had the scale to see it. He made visible what was there. He brought the map home. That was what navigators did. He lived for another 120 years after the third outer survey return, and they were the fullest years of his life. Full in the way that late life can be full when the work of the early years is clarified, when the things that mattered have been distinguished from the things that seem to matter, when the remaining questions are the ones that were always the deepest questions, the ones that do not diminish in the presence of partial answers but grow richer. He continued to file charts. He continued to lecture to younger navigators, and his lectures changed in a way that the young navigators, bright, eager, that light the fresh white gold of early life, found both demanding and deeply compelling. He no longer lectured only about method, only about technique. He lectured about the relationship between observation and presence, about the difference between measuring a place and being in a place, about the quality of attention that allows the universe to show you something it is not showing to an observer who is simply passing through. He was not mystical about this. He was precise and scientific and rigorous, as he had always been, and he insisted on the same rigor in his students. But he was also, now, willing to say clearly and without qualification that precision and presence are not intention, that the most rigorous observation is also the most open observation, that the universe rewards both the careful measurement and the willingness to be surprised. He completed his personal logs, the private record he had kept for 4 centuries, and donated them to the collective's archive, alongside the official records, as a companion document. He had written in his final entry, "These are the things the official records do not contain, which are the most important things I have observed. What it felt like to be in a place. What I thought when I was afraid. What the universe looked like, from inside it, to a being who was paying close attention." He returned to the ceremonial grounds one final time, near the end of his life, when the amber gold of his light had deepened further into something the younger Sorvath now called deep resonance amber, a color seen only in beings who had lived so long and seen so much that the accumulated experience had become its own kind of light. He went alone, as he had gone before the third outer survey, and he stood in the center of the sacred space where the resonance of 3,000 years of Sorvath ceremony vibrated at the edges of perception. He performed the 8-beat. 2 quick, a pause. 1, a longer pause. 2 quick, a pause. 3 in slow succession. The first knowing, the sorrow and the return. The frequencies traveled out into the characteristic depth of the ceremonial space, and then farther and farther, carried by the magnetic current pies that ran through the heart of the home system, carried by the particular quality of attention that 4 centuries of navigation had given him, and he knew, in the way that he now knew things, that they traveled farther than the current paths, that they went where all frequencies of genuine meaning eventually go, into the deep structure of the universe that receives everything and preserves everything and returns everything in whatever form it can be returned in. He stood in the quiet and he felt the answer, not in words, not in the modulated frequency language of the Sorvath, not in the synthesized register he had built with the entity at the edge of everything, simply in the quality of the space around him, in the depth, in the resonance, in the particular frequency of a universe that has been listened to carefully enough and long enough that it begins, in its own way, to listen back. He was less alone. He had always been less alone. This was what he had found. At the edge of everything, in the space where stars went dark in a pattern of loss and return, in the signal left for him specifically, in the slow translation of a language older than the universe, in the gradual, accumulated understanding of 490 years of paying close attention to the cosmos. He had gone out to map the unknown and had found, as the best navigators always find, that the map and the territory were not separate things, that to know a place truly was to be changed by it, that the act of making the invisible visible is itself a form of relationship, that you cannot map the universe without the universe, in some sense, mapping you. He remained in the ceremonial ground for a long time, receiving the quality of that space, the resonance of that silence, the particular frequency of that ancient and patient presence that had always been there and that would be there still after the last star were prepared and the last light was held in whatever came next. Then he toned, and he went home. This story was brought to you by HSY Stories. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to experience every new story.